Hi, welcome to Ancestry Roads Webcast, where we talk about Appalachia, Appalachians. And today we have a great topic. Today we are going to talk about a brand new book that was just released. It's the Foxfire book of Appalachian women. And we have Cami Ahrens here to discuss it with us. First, let me give you a little bit of background information about the book. It's really a collection of 21 stories of women, of Appalachian women from the Georgia and Carolina areas of Appalachia. And it's a collection of community and place. And I love the community and place histories in this book. I tend to reach for those type of books anyway, but this one is pretty interesting because the way that it's set up is it starts from the very first interview in 1967 and then continues chronologically. So you truly get a feel for the place in the community as we go through the book. And it's a very diverse book. It has many different stories in different cultures. And we're going to talk about a few of them. We can't get into all of them. I wish we could. We would be here for hours. They first started in 1967. And we're going to tell you also a little bit about how these stories came to be. And at the end of this webcast, we're going to talk about how you can also participate in the stories. Let me introduce you first, though, to our guest, Cami Ahrens. She is a curator and director of education at Foxfire. And I can tell you right now that she's extremely busy. I'm so thankful that she was able to join us for this webcast. She does a tremendous amount at Foxfire, and she's responsible for curating all the artifacts and developing the exhibits that go on yearly and managing the educational programming at Foxfire. That alone is a lot of work that's done. And if you go up to Foxfire's website at any time, you can see all the different community events and educational events that they bring in. She also hosts a very awesome podcast called It Still Lives. And it is, if you really want to know some Appalachian culture, definitely tune into the podcast, It Still Lives. She also serves as an executive editor of the Foxfire magazine. And again, we're going to tell you how this ties into this particular book, and oversees the organization's hallmark leadership program for the local high school students who do go out and interview and get these stories that we're going to talk about today. Ǩēbī was originally from St. Louis and attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for graduate school, completing her master's in historical archaeology. Isn't that a perfect job for Foxfire? Before relocating to Georgia. And we are very proud to welcome her today and consider you a full-fledged Appalachian. So welcome, Cami, to the webcast. We appreciate your time here today.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to talk with you today.
I will tell you that I love this book. For many reasons, specifically because of the stories and the way that you presented it. And you can see I've got my own copy here. And I think this is truly one of these books where you've heard curl up and read a good book, cup of tea. This is it. This is the book that you want to do that with. I think part of the reason why I'm so intrigued by it is you give us a little bit of history, a little bit of background information before each woman's story is said. So we also know the place of where they're at when they're giving the story. I guess the mindset a little bit of where they're at. And the other thing that I so appreciate, and I know you probably hear this a lot, you kept their syntax. You did not change their grammar, the way they spoke, anything like that. You kept it so we can feel like we are there actually listening to the story live.
Yeah, those were both definitely conscious decisions because I wanted people to feel like they were sitting down with the women, and there's such a relationship that forms between the woman and the reader that it was important to maintain that as much as possible.
And I like that. You're so right, because I told Cami that I would not ask her for her favorite, and I'll ask her, don't ask me for my favorite too, because it changes by the moment. I think every time you go back and you might reread a story, it changes. But for those of you that do not know anything about Foxfire, could you give us a brief overview? What is Foxfire and why this book?
Yeah, I always tell people that there's no good elevator pitch for Foxfire because it's such an incredible organization with so many different aspects to it. And so Foxfire began back in 1966 in a high school English classroom where these students were not interested at all in Shakespeare and they were giving their teacher a really hard time. And so the teacher, kind of at the end of his wits, turned it back to the students and said, what's going to interest you? How can I get you guys engaged in learning? And the students collectively decided that they wanted to write a magazine. And since it was an English class, they thought, well, a literary magazine would be what we'll do. And they went out and started talking to people about stories, wanting to publish some local folklore in the magazine alongside student creative writing and poetry and art and all that kind of stuff. So the students went to elders in their community, so whether it was their grandparents or maybe an older neighbor, and talking to them about their childhoods and seeing what kind of stories they knew about the region. And the more that they talked to them, the more the students realized these elders had such valuable experiences that were being lost. So in the 1960s, the people they were talking to had been born in the 1870s and 1880s and were still living in ways that were reminiscent very much of an earlier century. Most of them still lived in houses that their great-grandparents had built and lived in, log cabins. They were living without running water, very limited electricity. They were still growing their own food. And so they captured these stories and these traditions and put them into the Foxfire magazine. So the first Foxfire magazine was published in 1967, and it was a huge hit. So the students continued the project, and they decided that they wanted to record the story so that it would make it easier to put the magazine together. So they took tape recorders with them, reel-to-reel tape recorders, big reel-to-reel tape.
I know. I see the pictures. Can you guys imagine? Now, we just take our phone.
I know.
They were carrying some equipment with them.
Yes, none of this was easy. So they're lugging around these tape recorders, and they are recording these stories, and it just became this collective oral history project born out of the community. And it's a project that we've continued since 1966. So I'm proud to say that every single year, as Sandy mentioned, we have a leadership program now that engages students with their community and encourages them to get out, to sit down, to listen to stories, and to collect those stories. So Foxfire has an archive with all of these oral histories in them. And we are, as far as I know, the largest organization with continuous collection in the Southern Appalachian region. We have nearly 2,700 oral histories.
That was my next question, 2,700 and growing.
Yeah, and growing every year. We grow every year. And so most of those are student conducted. There are some that I do for the podcast and have done for specific projects, but the majority of those oral histories are captured and processed by students, which is pretty amazing. And so the Foxfire magazine grew into the Foxfire book series, which is part of what this book contributes to, is that
I think that's where people were getting confused. Is it a magazine or is it a book? And I'm like, well, it's kind of both.
It's both.
It's both.
It's also a museum.
Yeah.
We're also an educational program. So we have a lot of arms, but it all comes back to a central core of focusing on community engagement and intergenerational learning. So everything that we are today, the books, the magazine, the museum, and the education aspect was all born out of that initial contact between students and their community members.
I mean, this is pretty amazing. If you think about initiating a program like that in a high school today, you would think, okay, we can do this. This is pretty easy. But if you're thinking back, we're talking 1966, 67, when this concept came about, it's unheard of back then. And it was all because, like you said, well, okay, we've heard enough about Shakespeare. We've heard enough about some of these other things. So what else are we going to learn, and how are we going to learn it? And actual getting out into the community. It was just unheard of back then. And like you said, we were lugging our equipment and cameras. They had cameras as well, right? To take the photos that are also in the book.
Yes, they had cameras, they had still cameras. And then in the 70s, they actually received a grant to purchase some video cameras. So we do have some early industry film as well of some of the interviews that they went on, which is really cool.
That is very cool. That is very. Now, let's talk a little bit about the book itself. And again, I highly recommend everybody, if you love history, if you have a love of Appalachia, if you have a love of stories, these, I tend to, when I watch documentaries or movies, if anytime a film comes on, it says based on a true story, I'm instantly tuned in. And that's part of the love that I have for this book too. You are hearing the stories directly from these women. This is not something that, that Cammie said, well, let's put this together and say, this is what I think they thought, or anything like that. You're giving us the stories. And they range from the women who, like you said, had lived without electricity and made their meals on a fire. There's one story where she lived with her grandfather, and her grandfather told her all about the Civil War and the details of that. There's other stories where we have diverse culture, and we're going to talk about that also in a few minutes, about where they talk about some of the African Americans talk about the Jim Crow laws and things like really serious things, hangings, and what they experienced, and segregation, where they couldn't go to a dance, for example, they had a colored dance versus a full dance for the whole community. And then you also, we find some Latinas in the indigenous people in this book. So this book has a little bit of everything for the history of the place and the community. So let's go ahead and then talk just a little bit. So we know that these stories were collected from around 1967 to 2022. That are in the book?
The last interview was, in 2020, just because of the publication and everything, how long it takes. But yeah, a long span of time for sure.
That was probably a good thing, because then COVID set in was too. So you probably couldn't go too much further unless somebody submitted. And so these students are actually still going out and seeking and finding their elders to talk to and record.
Yes, and we actually encourage our students today to look at different aspects of Appalachian culture and how it's changing, and how, being shaped by influences today. So we do allow students to not necessarily always interview an elder, but how maybe is a young person, which we've seen in the book with Sandra and Dakota's stories on the younger spectrum. How are they carrying their cultures, and how are they shaping Appalachian culture today? So we do allow the students to look at a different spectrum of age and culture as well.
I think that's really important, and I thank you for mentioning that, because for those of us that study Appalachian, have studied it, and people kind of ask us, well, where is Appalachia? What is Appalachia? The first thing we do is we sigh and go, well, it's complicated. And then we start talking a little bit about it and explain why it's complicated. But I think also, when you're trying to put together a group of people, I especially like in the book, it says that, Appalachia has always been diverse, and there's always been diversity, but it's not always told or not talked about or shared with stories. And your book does a fabulous job of combining that diversity. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the women as well. And I'll bring up, this is your Facebook page, and I'll bring this up in 21 stories. And these are, once you get the book, you'll see so much more than just the one picture or the two picture. And like I said, when you read the book, you're starting at 1967 and you're going all the way through. So when we say it's a history of place, we really mean that. You are reading how these women lived each decade and all the way through. It's quite entertaining to also see, if you know this particular area of Rabun County, they talk about how there was no road, and now there's the road, and there was no grocery store, and one lady had to take her mule to Otto to get groceries and things like that. So if you're familiar with this area, I'm in Georgia, so this is my backyard pretty much. It's hard to imagine going through Tiger or Clayton without the road. And now to get up to Cornelia, you've got a larger highway that's 70 miles an hour to get up there. So definitely it was entertaining to read the book and see all the changes as well as their stories. And I guess let's start with talking about a couple different women in the book. And again, I wish I could talk to a bunch of the women here and just play their stories. I kind of went and selected some that really hit me at the heart, and I totally biased, I admit. So Anna Tutt, could you tell us a little bit about Anna Tutt? She lived through the Jim Crow and the segregation. And and we were talking before the webcast, something that she also talked about that's just unheard of. So could you tell us a little bit about Anna?
Yeah, Anna's a remarkable person. And she really, when I was preparing for this book, her story really stood out. And I just knew it had to be a part of the narrative that's constructed by the book. And so Anna grew up the daughter of a sharecropper, but her father died when she was young. And so they moved up to around Cornelia, Georgia to live with her grandmother. And so she speaks a lot about growing up as a daughter of a sharecropper in a time of Jim Crow laws and the stress that it put on her and her family. Her father was concerned at one night about a potential lynching that was happening nearby. She doesn't go into details because she was young, so it's not confirmed, that it was a lynching, but there was a hanging of some sort, and it's reasonable that her father would have certainly witnessed lynchings around him, which is kind of chilling to think about. And then she moves into her years living with her grandmother, and she speaks in such beautiful ways about her grandmother with such reverence and respect. And the difference between her character and her grandmother's. And then as a young woman, Anna talks a lot about the work opportunities that were available to her as a Black woman in Georgia, in North Georgia, and the relationships that she had with her white employers, which sheds light, on a lot of the segregation that happened during that in and around the civil rights movement as well. And then one of the things that really stands out and is not talked about in many other places is her experience with mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
So she talks about her relationships with different men, and the men, she did not date great guys.
No, she didn't, and she struggled. Well, if I'm trusting and trusting they,
Yeah,
you're right. She did
and,
not.
and so she confesses to having a mental breakdown, and she shares some information, a conversation that she had with her doctor, and just the way that she describes that and opens up to the student who would have been interviewing her at the time is really remarkable. It's just a deep vulnerability that she shares with us. And I think there's a lot of aspects of her story that people can relate to in terms of relationships, whether with a grandmother or mental health. And then there's certainly aspects that are hard for us to conceive of, but are important for us to know nonetheless.
And I was just really, truly blown away, like you said, that to speak to what many people would consider a kid, a child, a high schooler, and be so open and honest. But also, if you read her story in the book, all her pictures have this beautiful smile. There's one of her that looks like she's kind of dancing a little bit. And there's joy just coming out of her as well. And you read her story and you aspire to be someone who can do that. And she never married.
No, yeah, that's one of the incredible things about all the women in the book is their resiliency, and it comes through so much in their stories.
It's really amazing how these these kids, these students, captured it. They captured their true essence in these photos. So that was really inspiring to me to see that. Now I want to switch gears completely. Now, just a little bit of background. My family comes mostly from West Virginia, and there is a large Italian population there. And one of the complaints that you'll hear from that culture and that population is, well, we did not have beans and cornbread. We had sauce, and we had something called pepperoni rolls. And we kind of get upset that we're lumped in to this beans and cornbread, I guess, of victuals of Appalachia. And so that's why I asked Cammie if she would talk a little bit and kind of compare, contrast as we talk, two immigrants that came into Appalachia, because as we say, not only is Appalachia complicated, but it is diverse, and we don't talk about that as much anymore. You normally hear in Appalachia studies and Appalachia type of material the Scots and the Irish, and it kind of ends there. You don't hear much about. So there's two immigrant ladies that really they have a similar thing going on, but they are so diverse as well. And the very first one is Angelina Davis. And if you are into history, her particular section was fascinating to see from an Italian perspective of World War II. And I did not expect that. I did not expect hers to include that at all. Were you surprised when you started reading that particular point, or did you think no, she's going to talk about that and the community of Clayton?
When I first read her story, I just kind of encountered it and was just reading through it with an open mind, because there wasn't much context around the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a very gripping tale with
Mm-hmm.
a lot of important experiences that she shares with us. And the reason I included Angelina and Sandra, who's the second
Mm-hmm.
immigrant woman featured in the novel, or excuse me, in the book, not a novel volume, they both, even though they're not from Appalachia, even though, at the time of her interview, Sandra had not been living in Appalachia too long, it's a good reminder of the experiences that we bring with us into this place. And
Mm-hmm.
our experiences shape our sense of place, but it also shapes the community around us. So it's important to know those other stories that these people are bringing in with them. And so Angelina obviously is in a different time period, and so we can look back with a historic perspective. But growing up in a country that in the 1930s and early 40s that is predominantly Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
an urban area, and the culture is obviously completely different. And to understand her experiences that led her to Clayton is really a great read.
Mm-hmm.
But then she arrives at Clayton, and her seeing this part of Appalachia in the 1950s for the first time as a woman who can't speak English, doesn't have any people like her around, really, how she adapts is really incredible. And to see it from an outside lens, I think is really valuable for us as well.
I think so too, because I think that we as Appalachians need to see that it's not just the generations and generations and generations that populated it originally. And those cultures that are coming in do bring so much into it. And I the first part of her story is a little intense, because you're reading it and you're trying to put yourself in her place. And then the second half kind of makes you giggle just a little bit. Like, she didn't know how to eat corn, for example. And they kept saying, well, don't you eat corn in Italy? No, our pigs do. So it was kind of interesting also to see what differences there are. But then when she came over and accepted Clayton accepted her. So I think that's important as we go to the next immigrant that I want to talk about, particularly because her story, Sandra's story, is here and now of what Appalachia is. And Sandra is pretty amazing story too. She was very, very open with her life. She came from Ecuador, went to Miami, I think had a brief stop in Tampa. But for those of you that know this particular area of Georgia where Foxfire is, Rabun County, so from Ecuador to Miami to Ghosts on the Roof, and Ghosts on the Roof is a popular tourist attraction there, and they stopped there to take a rest, get something to eat, see the ghosts on the roof, and then said, wait a second, I see a house pop up. We're going to move here. And they did. I mean, it was amazing that how just something like that. And they picked, this is their place where they're going to live. And not only live, she opened and owned a toy store in downtown Clayton.
Yeah, it's a good reminder of how this place can welcome people in and can become a refuge. And it's also a good reminder that, you know, everyone here was an immigrant at one point. So even though people like to talk about the Scots-Irish being the original settlers, they were immigrants too. They went through similar experiences, just in a different century. And Sandra represents a much larger population of Latinx people who have come into this region. And unfortunately, that community culturally and linguistically is pretty much closed. So you have to be a part of their community to be able to help understand and share their stories. So Sandra serves both in this book, but in our community as well, as kind of a gateway to that closed community, because she walks in both worlds. And so she does a lot of community outreach to help support the growing Latino community here, who have come mostly in as migrant workers, but have begun to open businesses. And you'll see that change in most places in Appalachia, specifically areas that have large agricultural industry or tourism industries. You'll see a growing migrant population. And so Sandra serves as a good representation of how those communities are shaping Appalachia today.
And I think then as we can kind of compare and contrast a little bit of Angelina's, where she came in and nobody spoke her language. She barely had a few words of English. Her religion wasn't really practiced up in the mountains of Catholicism. And people did embrace her, but she was still kind of cut off a little bit. And then you see Sandra come in and make this a town that she wants to live in, but also help. And like you said, she has one foot in both communities to try and bridge the gap. She was also very interesting, because she also was, I don't know if I'm Appalachian, but I'm going to embrace Appalachia as well. And I think the best way she did that too is by opening her toy store. And they did that as a need. They thought that was a missing item in the area. And I think that allowed not only the tourists, but the locals to come in, and then also the Latinx community to come in. And it did kind of break my heart a little bit to hear her say that if she speaks in Spanish to somebody, that some of the customers might not, really go with that. And they might say, okay, thank you and leave. But her answer was perfect. I'm not going to be rude. I'm not going to not speak back when somebody speaks to me. So I think, like you said, as the Scots-Irish came in as immigrants at one time and they made their way and accepted, I look forward to more immigrants coming into Appalachia and making it home as well. It happens everywhere in the United States. I like to tell people that the problems that Appalachia gets tagged with, and I'm not going to describe them, you guys know what they are. They're everywhere. And so the more that we see different cultures and different ideas come in, then we all grow. And that's where I think Angelina and Sandra, two different time periods, and I do see some positive difference happening in that time frame. And then the next one I want to speak about is something too a little personal for me, is Dakota Brown. And Dakota Brown is of Cherokee heritage, and she's trying really hard to go back. We talk about progress with immigrants. Well, she's trying to go back and regain her culture and fix the wrongs that had happened with her culture. And the reason why this is personal for me is, as a very, very small child, I don't even think I was in kindergarten, as we were doing the driving tour from West Virginia down to Florida. We stopped in Cherokee and they had the full headdress, and we have pictures. I still have pictures of that. And Dakota Brown talks about, this is not us. This is not who we are, and we can no longer, pander to the tourists for a buck. And we've got to really look at our culture and bring it back. And so if you look at the ones that I kind of picked, we have Anna Tutt, who survived Jim Crow laws and segregation. And then we took the two immigrants, and then now we've got Dakota saying, full stop. Let's go back and see if I can regain my culture. This is a tricky subject, so I'm going to ask you for your help because a lot of specifically Cherokee Indians did remain. They did not follow the Trail of Tears. And do they consider themselves Appalachian? And it's a tricky subject, but you included them in the book of Appalachian women.
They are the original Appalachian women. I mean,
Good.
Appalachia
Yeah.
would not be Appalachia without Indigenous peoples. And so much of what people today, talking about the culinary things that you didn't like to get packed with in West Virginia actually come from Indigenous peoples. So corn, we wouldn't have corn for Indigenous peoples, and hominy and all kinds of things. And so there are actually a few women from Indigenous descent in the book. So Amanda Swimmer is the first one. And then we have a Catawba woman. And then Dakota is kind of a modern Cherokee woman. And Dakota, it was interesting asking her about this because she grew up near Atlanta. And then she identifies her home as Cherokee, North Carolina, or rather the Snowbird community specifically. And so she lives on the Qualla boundary today. And talking to her about her identity, and she is Cherokee first. I mean, that's her first identity, but she does identify to some degree with Southern identity and Appalachian identity. And her colleagues at the Museum of the Cherokee Indian are working really hard and just doing some incredible things to really elevate contemporary Indigenous identity and how indigeneity influences the larger Appalachian culture, and really bringing that to the forefront of people's attention and reshaping how we think of Appalachia. So they are doing really incredible work to kind of rework that.
They really are. They the garden, the Three Sisters garden, that they took a patch and they said we're going to do this. They also, as I know Foxfire does as well, seed banks. And for an indigenous culture to come up with a seed bank is just really special, because they are bringing it back and saying let's correct some of the things that people think about us that are wrong. So I do really like that. And there's one other thing that I was happy to see. And I will tell you, Kimmy, this is a pretty interesting topic, because we debate in a lot of our Appalachian groups about whether or not the American or Native American Indians, the indigenous, are Appalachian. And it's a big debate, and we leave it up to them to tell us pretty much. But the one sentence that she put in the book was that she saw parallels between the way that indigenous and Appalachians are thought of and talked about. And when I read that, it brought it home to exactly what you said. They were the original. So it makes sense to me that they would see some of the things, the negativity things that are said about the Appalachians are also said about the indigenous. And I was shocked when she would go tell somebody, about herself, and they go, "Oh, I thought you all died off." And I was just shocked at the road that she has to climb and travel through to fix a lot of the things that have been said wrong. But again, she was extremely open. So is there a secret that these kids, these students have to get some of these very, very open communications going?
I think there's just a special relationship that comes from a young person asking someone older about their experiences. I think that the students, when they have genuine interest, go to these people, go to these folks, that the people who are being interviewed are willing, because they want to impact those students in a positive way. They want to leave a difference on those students from their own experiences. But one of the most important things when you're doing an oral history is to make sure that you conduct it with respect and openness and transparency. And so starting off a conversation with what you're interested in, what you're expecting out of the conversation, and making sure that you understand that person's expectations of you as an interviewer is the first and most important step to conducting an oral history. And so that always sets the stage for a positive interaction.
So I think Well, I know that you have an oral history or project for Appalachian women that people can go and upload on your website. And does anybody say, I will give you this information, but don't publish it until 2030? Or does everybody pretty much say, here, if they submit it, here it is to the students or whether online to you and say, feel free to publish now?
Yes. So if we conduct an interview in person, it goes into our archive. And that is based on an agreement that the interviewee signs. So they sign a formal agreement that basically donates their oral history to our archive, and we in turn preserve it in perpetuity for that individual and their family. There are instances where the individual interviewed might say, oh, I didn't mean to say that, or please don't publish that. And so we'll redact that information from any publication that we use. And so that information
That makes sense.
regarding anything like that would be contained within the interview file. Now, the project that you're mentioning is a crowdsourced oral history project. So that operates a little bit differently. That we just accept submissions with a online release form with the understanding that those will be used either digitally or the audio can be used for podcast, or we're working on agreement potentially with a local public radio station that might use some of those oral histories.
Oh, that's great.
And then we would recontact the person if they wanted it for our archive, because then at that point it could be considered for publication. So it operates a little bit differently, but the crowdsource project is meant to just give people the opportunity to contribute to the ever-growing narrative of women's experiences in Appalachia. So you don't have to be a woman. You can share a memory of a grandmother or a woman that you know who lived in Appalachia.
That's a great point. That's a very great point. So for any of the guys out there, if you had, everybody has their mom or their grandmother, especially with food. We always talk about food with Appalachia. So your grandmother was probably always making like a rhubarb cobbler or something like that. They can contribute to talk about their relative or their ancestor. That's great.
Yes. And all of that information is just through our website. You can just go to foxfire.org, and on our header at the top of our website page, you'll see share our story. And if you just click that link, it'll take you to the project page and you can learn more about it and how to submit.
And also, just so everybody knows, the link to Foxfire and the link to share our story is also in the description. So you can just click on that, as well as the book link to buy the book. And I just posted up into the chat the link for the Appalachian Women Oral History Project. So then let's talk just real quickly. Is there a common thread amongst all these women in the 21 stories of the book?
Yes, I do think that there's a common thread that emerges, and that's relationship to place. I think each of the women speaks of place in terms that almost personify it. There's kinship shared with this specific landscape that each of the women honors through their story, that the landscape offers them something in return as well. It's a source of strength that helps make them resilient, and it's something that's going to be carried on, I believe. So that is a really strong thread that emerges.
And again, if you love history, this book is definitely for you. It does give you that sense of place. I've been visiting there, like I said, since I was a child, and I'm discovering new ways to learn about this place that I love so much through your book. So I appreciate that. And I love that you did include so much diversity so I can learn as well. It's not just, I kind of know the street or the road or the highway or things like that. I learn about these women and what they actually live through day to day throughout their life. And then I've got two more really easy questions. And I noticed there's at least one or two questions in the chat. So I guess my next question to you would be, what can we learn from these women?
Oh, what can't we learn? That's a tough question to answer, because I think each woman offers their own lessons, whether you're looking at it from just needing a general understanding of what Appalachia is and how it's changed and what makes up Appalachia, to as deep as learning about relationships and navigating self and understanding yourself, because there's so many women who share their own stories of personal growth and how they related to those around them, and then also how they were able to relate to themselves. And I think those are really powerful messages that they share that I hope offer some, lessons and some sense of camaraderie with people who read it.
I think you're right. I know throughout stories, I picked little pieces out of almost every story where I felt like that was me. I can understand that, or I would be there right with you doing the same thing. Like I would definitely be riding the mule. It was her best friend. The last question I'm going to ask you is, before we go to the chat, is what are we getting wrong about Appalachian women?
I think, like all other stereotypes of Appalachia, it's just been reduced down to one thing. We see images of poor white women, this idea of a tough mountain woman, and it's so wrong. I mean, it just does a disservice to the many, many stories that make up this region. So I think this book offers us a sampling, and certainly not comprehensive, not complete, but just a beginning of understanding how many different types of people, different experiences make up this culture, and the ways that we influence each other, and the ways that we have cultural exchange and learn and grow from each other. So I think this is a good way to look at communities and how communities can vary over time and across place. And so I encourage people to read it with an open mind.
I agree. And we talk about changing the narrative of Appalachia, and to me, this book did. If you just gave me the pictures, you could see not only the experience of their life, but you just really see them come through. If you just gave me a picture book, I would do that. But you were so kind and gave us not only their stories, but keep in mind, before each woman's stories, 𝐾𝐬𝐸 gave you a little bit of background about this particular person or this particular time, which really helps you get into the place before you start reading the story. So I appreciate it. So since you said that this was obviously not all encompassing of everything, we do have a question about that. Will more books be in the future? I assume more books similar, more stories in the future.
Well, every Foxfire publication is done in a similar format where it's an oral history shared. Traditionally, the Foxfire books focus more on a lot of how-to articles or maybe thematic topics. There is the possibility in the future for us to do another publication like this where it's curated stories from across all of our publications. So that's something I didn't mention, that the book has stories that have been published, but they're new edited versions. Some of them were featured in other books, other magazines, and some of them were never published before. So another collection like that might be in the making for us. But we also, focus on a lot of how-to skills. So we have talked a little bit about doing some more books like that. And then we've also done a cookbook. And I think our publication before this was a book of folklore. So we do a variety of publications, but I could see in the future us doing another book like this.
Another book. And also I can see way in the future if someone will be talking about us at this point in time. Now I do have somebody in the audience. He's actually been anxiously waiting for this webcast, and his name is Steve, the Steve deal. And Steve, help me out. Let's see if I can remember this. Steve, in 1967, I believe it was his grandfather, maybe, actually worked at Foxfire or something. When did Foxfire started doing magazines? In 1967. And when did you have the property there? Was that the same time frame where you have all
the museum was purchased in 1972.
1972. So I was hoping he popped back in. I hope I didn't lose him. But he was so anxious about this because I can't remember. But he said that I want to say he was like the business manager or somebody who did the paperwork behind the scenes. So he was very excited to come up and share a story about his ancestor that actually was there. But he might have left early, a little bit early. Okay. And I think some of the other questions that I saw we did already answer about the diversity. And if you guys have any questions at all after this webcast, again, 𝐾𝐬𝐸 can be reached at Foxfire. email or excuse me, the website is in the description, as well as the oral history. Oh, we do have Steve. And the link to buy the book. So he was there. Oh, in the 40s and 50s. Steve, was that must have been Rabun County, not Foxfire? I'm guessing, wouldn't you say, Cammie? That's what I'm guessing as well. He must have been because this started as a partnership with Rabun County High School students, and then Foxfire put their stories in the magazine. Did I get that right?
Foxfire was an outgrowth of a class at Rabun County School, and then it shifted to a class at Rabun County High School. And then the organization kind of grew and then supported the program at the high school until 2018, when we became, all at the museum property where we are today.
And then, so if you have somebody, if you want to have the interviews, the high school kids still come to you and go through Foxfire to do that?
Yes, we have a 7-week immersive summer leadership program. So it's a paid summer job, basically, for the students. And so during that time, we give them opportunities to engage with their community, to develop skills for post-secondary success. And they also have the opportunity to learn and practice a traditional craft skill like blacksmithing or weaving.
Okay, let's see. Here's Steve. He was with Raven Gap as a farm family manager, then the business manager. This was a very interesting point too. This was one of the earlier stories in the book, that back in the day, for farms, they would just have open range up in North Georgia. Your cows would just open range, and then they had to kind of bring that in with the range laws, and all of a sudden you had to have fences and things like that. So I bet that's kind of similar to what Steve said with the farm family manager and then the business manager up there.
Yeah, he's referring to Rabun Gap and Coochie School. They had families that lived and worked at the school and provided all of the food for the school. So I think that's what he's referring to, which is
that's pretty cool
story. Yeah.
Well, then let me ask you this real quick. I know I said that was going to be the last question. I kind of fibbed. Do you see a Foxfire book of Appalachian men's stories?
It's very possible. A lot of men's stories have been predominantly featured throughout the Foxfire books. So that's one of the reasons why we put out these narratives. But there are many ways that, the stories relate to each other. And I could see a lot of different possibilities in the future for pulling out more of these stories for the archive and weaving them together to create a strong narrative of the place.
With both of them, with a combination. And it says the Welcome Center was the first school, then the FR house, and lived there. I guess this was your ancestors there in the 40s and 50s. I'm not sure what the FR house is, the farmhouse. Well, let me again thank Cammie for being here today. I can tell you when I say that this is truly the book that you want to curl up in, especially it's been kind of cold down here in Georgia, and I know around the region of Appalachia, all the way up north. Get a nice cup of tea, settle in, and read the book. You will love it. You will also read it many, many times. But I think that, the Fry House. There we go, the Fry House. I think what I want to make sure everybody knows is, as we wind down this particular webcast, I really want to encourage everybody that's listening, that watches this, and encourage you to speak to others, to do your own oral history with yourself, your parents, your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, whoever. I really encourage you, because these stories that you read in this particular book really demonstrates to us how valuable those stories are. And a lot of people don't think, well, I'm not going to go record my parent. This seems silly. No, definitely go and record them, because this book proves that the history will live on with these people, your ancestors. They will, your descendants will come back to them and love to have this. And I know that we have a lot of genealogists that also watch our webcast, and what better source can you have than from the source and their person there? So I definitely want to encourage everybody to go and do your own oral histories. If you need help, I can tell you that, again, down in the description, there's a link to Foxfires, and you have great questions. You also have a great instruction on how to set up the equipment and what needs and what you don't need. So everything that you need to do this in your own environment is in the Foxfire project link down in the description. And I definitely want to thank you, Cammie, for digging in. I know there was a lot of stories. You said 2,700 plus stories. So I really want to thank you for digging in and finding these particular ones. They're very special. And it's a book that I know I'll cherish and read over and over again. So thank you for joining us, but thank you also for the book.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me today.
And before I leave, I do want to mention too, again, for those of you that are anywhere nearby, so the 21st, you'll be at Rabun County Library with the book, and you can buy the book there and Cammie will sign it, right? And then also at 22nd, I know a lot of you have been to this place, the John C. Campbell School. A lot of us go there for learning. Cammie will also be there. So that's a great bonus. You can also sign up for a class there and buy a book from Cammie and get it signed. So if you are local, definitely stop by and see her and get the book from her. If you're not local, again, the link is in the description to buy the book. And thanks, Cammie. I appreciate it.
You're so welcome. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.